A quick new idea, daily, from the world's greatest TEDx talks. I'm your host, Atossa Leoni, and this is TEDx Shorts. The first time a student used the N-word in her class as part of a quotation, history professor Elizabeth Stordeur Pryor shut the discussion down completely. Now, a decade later, her views on incorporating the word into academic discourse have gotten more complicated. Today, she explains how thoughtful consideration of our encounters with this slur can actually help reshape the framework through which we confront the history of American racism.
The minute she said it, the temperature in my classroom dropped. My students are usually laser focused on me, but they shifted in their seats and looked away. I'm a Black woman who teaches the histories of race and U.S. slavery. I'm aware that my social identity is always on display, and my students are vulnerable too, so I'm careful. I try to anticipate what part of my lesson might go wrong. But honestly, I didn't even see this one coming. None of my years of graduate school prepared me for what to do when the N-word entered my classroom. I was in my first year of teaching when the student said the N-word in my class. She was not calling anyone a name. She was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. She came to class with her readings done. She sat in the front row, and she was always on my team. When she said it, she was actually making a point about my lecture by quoting a line from a 1970s movie, a comedy, that had two racist slurs, one for people of Chinese descent and the other the N-word. As soon as she said it, I held up my hand and said, whoa, whoa, whoa. But she assured me, it's a joke from Blazing Saddles. And then she repeated it. This all happened 10 years ago, and how I handled it haunted me for a long time. It wasn't the first time I thought about the word in an academic setting. I'm a professor of US history. It's in a lot of the documents that I teach. So I had to make a choice. After consulting with someone I trusted, I decided to never say it, not even to quote it, but instead to use the euphemistic phrase, the N-word. Even this decision was complicated. I didn't have tenure yet, and I worried that senior colleagues would think that by using the phrase, I wasn't a serious scholar, but saying the actual word still felt worse. The incident in my classroom forced me to publicly reckon with the word, the history, the violence, but also anytime it was hurled at me, spoken casually in front of me, anytime it rested on the tip of someone's tongue, it all came flooding up in that moment, right in front of my students. And I had no idea what to do. So I've come to call stories like mine points of encounter. A point of encounter describes the moment you come face to face with the N-word. If you've ever been stumped or provoked by the word, whether as the result of an awkward social situation, an uncomfortable academic conversation, something you heard in pop culture, or if you've been called the slur or witnessed someone getting called the slur, you have experienced a point of encounter. And depending on who you are and how that moment goes down, you might have a range of responses. Could throw you off a little bit, or it could be incredibly painful and humiliating. I've had lots of these points of encounter in my life, but one thing is true. There's not a lot of space to talk about them, right? That day in my classroom was pretty much like all of those times I had an uninvited run-in with the N-word. I froze because the N-word is hard to talk about. The N-word is not just a word. It's not neatly contained in a racist past, a relic of slavery. Fundamentally, the N-word is an idea disguised as a word. That Black people are intellectually, biologically, and immutably inferior to white people. And I think this is the most important part, that inferiority means that the injustice we suffer and inequality we endure is essentially our own fault. Right? So, yes, it is. Speaking of the word only as racist spew or as an obscenity in hip-hop music makes it sound as if it's a disease located in the American vocal cords that can be snipped right out. It's not, and it can't. And I learned this from talking to my students. So next time class met, I apologized and I made an announcement. I would have a new policy. Students would see the word in my PowerPoints, in film, in essays they read, but we would never, ever say the word out loud in class. Nobody ever said it again, but they didn't learn much either. Afterwards, what bothered me most was that I didn't even explain to students why, of all the vile, problematic words in American English, why this particular word had its own buffer, the surrogate phrase, the N-word. Most of my students, many of them born in the late 1990s and afterwards, didn't even know that the phrase, the N-word, is a relatively new invention in American English. When I was growing up, it didn't exist. But in the late 1980s, Black college students, writers, intellectuals, more and more started to talk about racist attacks against them. But increasingly, when they told these stories, they stopped using the word. Instead, they reduced it to the initial N and called it the N-word. They felt that every time the word was uttered, it opened up old wounds, so they refused to say it. They knew their listeners would hear the actual word in their heads. That wasn't the point. The point was they didn't want to put the word in their own mouths or into the air. By doing this, they made an entire nation start to second-guess themselves about saying it. This was such a radical move that people are still mad about it. Critics accuse those of us who use the phrase, the N-word, or people who become outraged, just because the word is said, of being over-principled, politically correct, or as I just read a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, insufferably woke, right? I wish I could go back to the classroom that day and push through my fear to talk about the fact that something actually happened, not just to me or to my Black students, but to all of us. I think we're all connected by our inability to talk about this word. But what if we explored our points of encounter and did start to talk about it? Today, I try to create the conditions in my classroom to have open and honest conversations about it. One of those conditions, not saying the word. So I come prepared. I hold the conversation with a tight rein, and I'm armed with knowledge of the history. I always ask students the same question. Why is talking about the N-word hard? Their answers are amazing. They're amazing. More than anything, though, I have become deeply acquainted with my own points of encounter, my personal history around this word. Because when the N-word comes to school, or really anywhere, it brings with it all of the complicated history of US racism, the nation's history, and my own, right here, right now.
The TEDx talk you just listened to was recorded at a TEDx event in East Hampton, Massachusetts. All TEDx events are independently organized by volunteers who believe in TED's mission of ideas worth spreading. Special thanks to the organizing team at TEDxEasthamptonWomen. Want to listen to the full talk? Find Elizabeth's talk and more at ted.com/TEDxShorts. I'm Atossa Leoni. Thanks for listening, and see you tomorrow.